Welcome to another Wednesday night series of fellowship and study here at St. James's Episcopal Church. I'm Hilary Strever, the Senior Associate Rector here at St. James's. We're having Dr. Edward Bond is joining us tonight for part 2 of a 6-part series on uncovering our history. So many of you know that you already know that our Racial Justice and Reconciliation team had some folks who were interested in researching their own genealogies and their own families' connections with things like slavery and racism and that sort of thing. And as they were digging into their own genealogies, they were curious about St. James's too, especially as we were reading some histories about Richmond and about the Episcopal Church. So as they've been digging around, they decided that they wanted to put all of their findings into one place, a working document, and share it with the rest of the parish. So as you this series was pulled together in a way to present their findings, but before we can hear their findings, we wanted to get a lay of the land, find out what was going on in Richmond during the same time period and what was going on in the Episcopal Church in the same time period. So the first part covers 1830 to 1865, the founding of St. James's until the end of the Civil War. And last week we heard from Dr. Greg Kimball, who is the historian who has written the book on antebellum Richmond and he works at the Library of Virginia. Tonight, we are honored to have Dr. Edward Bond here to tell us about the Episcopal Church during roughly the same time period. And what he has to tell you tonight, you might be surprised to learn about. If you've seen my post on Facebook yesterday, you'll already have a little hint of what's to come. Dr. Bond is a historian who has worked extensively on the Diocese of Virginia. He hails from Natchez, Mississippi, so thank you for joining us from all the way from Mississippi. And he is the editor-in-chief of now let me make sure I get this straight, of the Anglican and Episcopal History Journal.
Anglican Episcopal History, right.
Okay, I wanted to make sure I got that right. And he has taught the Episcopal Church history at Sewannee School of Theology and at the historically Black University, Alabama A&M University down in Alabama, sorry, Mississippi. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on over to you, Doctor.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start with a brief story. So you see there's more threats of disunion than just the Civil War in 1860. The anonymous author of a letter to the editor of the Southern Churchman, written in late July 1860, raised a question that troubled many Americans. Must we be divided? And the Southern Churchman was the diocesan newspaper of the Diocese of Virginia. Decades in the making, the crisis may have advanced too far to be averted. Already, the author feared many people had determined the issue in advance and could foresee nothing less than from the contending parties than an irrepressible conflict. Did such observers not understand, the author suggested, that good and honorable men were on both sides of the issue? Put aside the extremists, he urged, and be willing to concede that the two parties' moderates approached agreement on the fundamental issues at stake. Could Christian charity and forbearance not prevent disunion? Despite the potential for moderation and compromise, this writer nonetheless worried that disunion was at hand, that the high church and evangelical enthusiasts would create two churches in the place of one and rend irrevocably the fabric of the Episcopal Church in the United States. So July 1860, and the Episcopal Church is worrying about division.
Thank you. Thank you.
Not about division of the United States. Hillary, could you put up the church parties handout?
Yes.
I just can't see it. Okay. Before we get into church parties, one of the other things you should be aware of about this period we're talking about is how rural the Episcopal Church was. In parts of the country, bishops were riding on the top of train cars to get around. Bishops were holding services in saloons. In other cases, the Bishop of Mississippi, William Mercer Green, complained about people bringing dogs to church. He was much bothered by dogs at one church and thought that people should leave their dogs at home. The two church parties, the High Church and the Evangelicals, supported one position more than the other: baptismal covenant or adult renewal. The High Church supported baptism, and the Evangelicals emphasized adult renewal. And you can kind of link the High Church baptism to their views on episcopacy. For High Church Episcopalians, episcopacy was mandatory. You did not have a legitimate church unless it had bishops as its form of government. And for the High Church Episcopalians, episcopacy was central to the baptismal covenant, because you had to enter that covenant as Christ had ordained with the chosen representatives, bishops. So you joined the church for the High Church in baptism, and naturally but not inevitably came to live a renewed life. The High Church also used the early church, the very early church, the primitive church, as an example. From the 1st century to the rise of the papacy in the 5th century. This is the period when you had a small but pure church that reflected the practices of the New Testament. This was the period when the creeds were formalized and church polity and liturgy were regularized. And the church in that early period was also surrounded by a hostile population. And that's important because the High Church movement originated in New York City, where the Episcopal Church was under siege from other Protestant denominations. In fact, before the American Revolution, the Church of England told Anglicans in New York to stop asking for a bishop, that they weren't going to send one, because it would just exacerbate conflict with other denominations in the area. And that they actually worked out practical toleration before the revolution. So the primitive writers were clear on the Trinity, and they were clear on polity. For evangelicals, episcopacy was simply one legitimate form of church government among others. It was not necessary. So this is one big difference between the two parties. There were great fears in the 1830s and on that American values of liberty and freedom of opinion would harm the church. And the High Church, by grounding themselves on the primitive church, protected against what they called the anarchy of private judgment. So think about the time frame also when we talk about the 1st to the 5th century and the importance of episcopacy. This allows the High Church to support episcopacy while at the same time denying papal supremacy. Let's see here, okay. In terms of grace, the evangelicals and the High Church saw this differently. For High Churchmen, grace functioned regularly and continually, like the dew in the morning rather than a violent storm. It cooperated with the individual more than overpowering the person and making them passive. It was less a road to Damascus experience. It was something that grew up within the context of the liturgy. For the high church, justifying faith was also a persuasion of the truth of the promises of God. In some ways, it was an intellectual rather than an emotional acceptance of the promises that God had made in the scriptures. So this led to criticism of the high church by evangelicals who said, you know, why do you allow open communion? If there's no need to have a change in your pious disposition to receive communion, then you can have people who are card playing and dancing and dueling and drinking receiving communion. And that was all seen as something private by the high church. For evangelicals, faith, repentance, and the work of the Holy Spirit were a requirement for joining the church. A conversion experience was the axis, if you will, around which an individual's religious life moved. It was a religion about the heart, about personal holiness and a new birth, that conversion experience. It was not the intellectual assent to a series of doctrines. And you had a huge problem here in the early Episcopal Church in the United States, which even before the 1850s and 1860s could have pulled things apart. And that's the Articles of Religion, Article 17 on predestination. And what the first presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, William White, agreed or set out was not to define what this article meant, but to allow it to be defined so that both parties could find legitimacy in it. So each side could interpret it the way they liked. And neither party took a side in the Calvinist Arminianism debate. And Calvinism is the idea from Calvin that the elect were chosen by God. Arminianism is the idea that God chooses the elect who he knew would choose him of their own free will. And this is kind of what divided these two parties, but they did not want to take a clear side. For the high church, this idea of allowing different people to interpret this article the way they wished led to a critical neutrality. They saw that this meant that there was error in John Calvin. For the evangelicals, they had a sympathetic neutrality and interpreted Article 17 to mean that there was truth in John Calvin and that they could support Reformed churches that did take a stand on predestination. And apparently there was only one seminary professor in the first 50 or 60 years of the Episcopal Church in the United States who did not accept this. And people questioned his sanity for not accepting this sort of compromise. Both parties were actually building upon sometime Archbishop in the English Church, Gilbert Burnet, who believed that the Bible held support for both positions. Burnet also supported something else in a different way that happened in the 1600s in Virginia. Apparently, the governor at the time, William Barclay, since there was a shortage of clergy, he began on his own ordaining deacons. No bishop here to do that, but the governor began ordaining deacons. And there's a little footnote there in the end of one of Burnet's books that when you have a crisis in the church like this, the civil authorities can step in and you can deal with the apostolic succession and proper ordination later. So that's a little bit shocking anyhow. So what happens with these two parties? And the high church emerges first, and the evangelicals then become their opponents. The high church emphasized the Episcopal Church's difference with other Protestants. They emphasized the apostolic succession, for instance. The evangelicals stressed the similarities, such as adult conversion. Some high church bishops, like William Mercer Green of Mississippi, were known on a number of occasions to rebaptize people if they thought they had not been baptized in an appropriate church to begin with, which is another kind of shocking sort of thing. So what we're dealing with in the early 1800s is the continuing drama of the meaning of the English Reformation. Probably a drama that's still going on. In the 1820s and 1830s, these two church parties came to a somewhat uneasy truce. And they came to this truce in a way that the evangelicals would later regret. They divided the mission field. The high church got the domestic mission field, and the evangelicals received the foreign mission field. So that meant, and there's also in the 1820s a new confirmation prayer that emphasized both baptism and adult renewal to make both parties happy. The first missionary bishop was Jackson Kemper. In some ways, the idea of missionary bishops goes back to the Bishop of New York, John Henry Hobart, who led missionary efforts in his diocese and was tremendously successful. So you have the high church influence here with the bishop leading missionary efforts in places where you don't have the church yet, or you don't have a diocese formed yet. So at his consecration in 1835, Jackson Kemper was told to preach the gospel to a ruined world. And in his 35 years as a missionary bishop, he traveled over 300,000 miles, often leaving just Christmas for his family. Of course, one of the other missionary bishops we'll get to later on was Leonidas Polk, one of the largest slaveholders in the country, who seems to have been a very sickly child or a very sickly individual until he became missionary bishop. He was at Monument in Richmond for a while. Are questions anybody have? I haven't seen any chats yet with that. Oh, there are some chats. Okay, see that. Hillary, could you put up the tracks for the times?
Absolutely.
To the extent that they had a truce, was disrupted in the late 1830s by events in Great Britain, the Oxford movement or Tractarianism. In 1830, between 1833 and 1841, a series of tracts were published. It began in 1833 with a tract known as National Apostasy, which lamented the state of religious affairs in Great Britain, especially Parliament interfering with the church. Now, what the tracts did was to emphasize piety in many ways, rather than the high church emphasis on bishops. it's also coming out at the time of the Romantic movement. So it's about feeling religious. If you have a religious setting that is a setting for religion that makes you think about religion, then you'll be religious. There's something of that there. Now, the tracts don't come to the United States until 1839. That's when they're first published here. And like Darwin, Freud, and Marx, Americans were not reading the originals. They were reading popularizations of them. And the high church and the evangelicals read past each other and thought past each other. For the high church, this was the tracts were a tool for devotion, for your prayer life, for your devotional life. For evangelicals, they saw them as introducing Roman Catholic theology into the church and deforming the English Reformation. Saw this as an attack on the English Reformation. And Virginians, who were perhaps the Episcopalians in Virginia, and this was perhaps the most evangelical diocese in the country. I mean, Bishop Meade is up at Episcopal High School in the 1840s, and he sees a copy of the tracts on one instructor's bookshelf and tells him he needs to find another job. So he ends up being a professor at General Theological Seminary. Virginians were very, very alarmed by the tracts for the times. Bishop Richard Channing Moore, in one of his last convention addresses, 1839, attacked the Oxford movement's dangerous innovations that threatened a revival of the worst evils of the Romish system. And it's significant that Moore even delivered this address, because the previous several diocesan conventions, he had not been able to do much more than show up and give a briefer and briefer list of his episcopal duties. But he took the time from that to attack the tracts. In 1841, the diocesan convention did condemn the Oxford movement, acting in what it called self-defense. 3 years later, at General Convention, evangelicals tried to have the Oxford movement condemned. It failed in the House of Deputies, and the House of Bishops issued a pastoral letter supporting justification by faith and condemning transubstantiation. Now, you need to see part of why people were in the United States were so concerned about the tracts. And I've argued that, you know, Americans were concerned about European ideas such as Darwin, Marx, Freud, but the Tractarians are the first in that movement. They're decades before that. This coincides in the 1840s and 50s with the height of Roman Catholic immigration to the United States. It is the time of the Know Nothing Party. You know, the Republican Party emerges in the 1850s and says there's a conspiracy of slaveholders against the United States. The Know Nothing Party said there's a conspiracy of Roman Catholics against the United States. One visitor to a Roman Catholic church was concerned that the only prayers in English were to the Virgin Mary, so no one really knew what was going on. In 1852, this became an even greater concern because Bishop Ives of North Carolina converted to Roman Catholicism. And what evangelicals called that was his, not conversion, but his perversion to Roman Catholicism. Converts from Protestant church were to Roman Catholicism were known as perverts. not converts. So you see here, the high church sees devotion. The evangelicals see a threat from Roman Catholic theology, and they simply talk straight past each other in the 1840s and 50s. And I've seen a question here that says, how were Americans confirmed before we had bishops? Well, if you go, they were not confirmed, although I believe there's one confirmation, there may be one confirmation sermon from colonial America in Virginia. It's possible that ministers established some sort of procedure. But if you look at the 1662 prayer book, to receive communion, the rubric says you had to be confirmed or be desirous of being confirmed. And that wasn't just a problem for the colonies, it was also a problem in Great Britain, because many bishops were absentee bishops. They didn't go and visit their diocese, and confirmation was not really as frequent as it was today. In fact, I know of one case where a convert from Methodism is ordained to the Episcopal priesthood in the morning and confirmed into the Episcopal Church in the afternoon, which seems to be the wrong order. Could you put up the Muhlenberg Memorial, please? One of the other very important things going on in the Episcopal Church in the United States is an effort by some church leaders to minimize this conflict between the high church and evangelical parties. And one of the most important of these was William Augustus Muhlenberg, rector of the Church of the Holy Communion in New York City. He was worried about the conflict between the high church and evangelicals hurting the church. And he gave an example in one case of an evangelical attacking one of John Henry Hobart's sermons. John Henry Hobart was the great leader of the high church movement. He said it reminded him of a woman beating her child for using profane language while swearing and beating the child. He opposed many of the high church sympathies, but he was sympathetic to the religious orientation of the tracts. He had a vision of a church, Catholic and Reformed, that it could include all Christians. Beyond this idea of trying to minimize the conflict between church parties is the idea, perhaps best seen in some ways with the National Cathedral, of the Episcopal Church being a bridge church to unite all Christians. And again, the high church and the evangelicals take different sides on that. Muhlenberg had a couple of concerns. One, that the church was limited geographically, that it was too narrow socially, its liturgy was too rigid, and all of that prevented it from doing the important work of preaching and dispensing the gospel to all sorts and conditions of men. He and his colleagues introduced this petition called the Muhlenberg Memorial at General Convention in 1853. And they wanted the church to establish some ecclesiastical system, broader and more comprehensive than that which you now administer, surrounding and including the Protestant Episcopal Church as it now is, leaving that church untouched, identical with that church in all its great principles, yet providing for as much freedom in opinion, discipline, and worship as is compatible with the essential faith and order of the gospel. he proposed two liturgical changes to he also encourages the Episcopal ordination of clergy from other denominations who would then be able to serve both their denomination and the Episcopal Church. So you get this idea of Protestant unity. Of the two changes he suggested, one was in the liturgy. The typical liturgy in the mid-1800s was morning prayer, ante-communion, and litany. And Muhlenberg and his colleagues proposed allowing clergy to alter this liturgy and introduce Bible readings and prayers not in the 1789 prayer book. Now, it was already the case that evangelical ministers sometimes shortened the liturgy so they'd have a longer time to preach. William Meade, the Bishop of Virginia, thought that a sermon of 15 to 20 minutes was ineffectual. There was a woman at I believe it was St. Stephen's, who complained that the sermon was only 17 minutes long and she hadn't yet begun to listen. For my point of view, I firmly believe what one of the professors at Sewannee taught, that a sermon should be about God in about 5 minutes. What Muhlenberg and his colleagues feared was that the worship in the Episcopal Church did not appeal to the lower classes. So they want to change things around a bit. And they did not think the liturgy was either aesthetically or emotionally appealing. His other idea was this ecumenical idea of recruiting clergy from other denominations who could be sound Episcopalians while at the same time remaining part of their denomination. There was a committee appointed to study this. The High Church argued against it because they saw that they believed that Episcopal distinctiveness was the only way to spread the church or spread the gospel. And General Convention in 1856 slightly changes some things. They criticized the organization of the church and recognized its missionary failures. They accepted greater variety in worship, which I'll touch upon more in a minute. They accepted extemporaneous preaching, a practice of the Great Awakening that many evangelicals had endorsed. And they also encouraged sisterhoods, greater attention to the instruction of children, and Christian unity. And this is the period also where you have your first Episcopal sisterhoods. And Muhlenberg helps with that also. And this really upsets the evangelicals who claim that it's a form of Mariolatry. So the House of Deputies opposed all of these changes, and the proposals had come to an end by 1859. As for the liturgical changes, by the early 1840s, there were choirs in the chancel, which was quite an innovation. Muhlenberg himself was putting candles and flowers on the altar. And in Virginia, in the 1890s, you had a bishop there who threatened to resign if a couple of parishes continued to do that. He said all these flowers, he wrote a tract about it, about how this was a tremendous evil being introduced in the church, having flowers on the altar. And, excuse me, I have a cat I had to put down. An evangelical bishop in Ohio tried to prosecute a minister for starting a vested choir. 1856 was a turning point in some ways because the General Convention allowed ministers to separate three parts of the service. This meant that you began to have what we often saw before COVID, The practice of early communion at an 8 o'clock service. Those people did not hear the Old Testament or the Psalm, and in some cases still don't. Sermons were rare for this early service. And this early service, as with today, emphasized the atonement more than the creation or the incarnation. The later service might be morning prayer with the Venite and the Te Deum, emphasizing the creation and the incarnation with little mention of the atonement at all. You also have the situation that you have in many Episcopal congregations today. The congregation stopped worshiping together. You had an 8 o'clock and a 10:30 or a 5:30 or something like that crowd. In 1868, the General Convention also allowed bishops to permit the use of a hymnal, Hymns Ancient and Modern, published in 1860. And this was radical. I mean, Virginians were very disturbed about some of the music. There's references to Virginians being angry about the hymn, "The Brightest and Best of the Stars of the Morning," because they thought they were worshiping a star. I see, Hillary, you look kind of shocked, but that's true.
I love that hymn.
And metrical psalms were rarely used. You have more approvals of hymnal. The church in this period approved texts for hymns, but not the music. They wouldn't approve music until about 1916 or so. Now let me pull something up here. You can go to slavery if you'd like.
And while I'm doing that, I'm not sure, but there may have been a few questions come in over the chat box.
I see one. It's, what is a sisterhood? And those were like sisterhoods in the Roman Catholic Church. They were nuns. Sometimes they lived in community and took vows. Sometimes they could take vows for a year at a time. One group of sisters was very, very important in the yellow fever epidemic in Memphis, and that led to greater acceptance of Episcopal sisterhoods. Another was essentially the unpaid nurses at, I think it's St. Luke, what's become St. Luke's Hospital in New York City. So you've got Episcopal nurses. At the same time, Florence Nightingale is doing this in Europe, trying to professionalize nursing. Now let me find something here. I need to, let's see, can I make this smaller? Is there a way I can make this smaller, Hillary?
Oh, yes.
So I can see my screen?
I believe if you go to the gallery view, the little button in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen, there should be an option where you can choose different views.
Okay, view. Okay, there we go. I'm going to, let's see. I don't want to make it larger. Enhance encryption. What's that? Okay, view. Oh, exit full screen. That's what I want to do. It will exit full screen. Well, this is not helping. Let's see.
See, next to the red button it says 125%. I wonder if you move that arrow down, if that might, I have no idea. But
Hillary, can I just not see your screen right now?
If you want everybody else to still see the screen, I can stop
We
sharing.
don't need, they don't need to see that right now.
Okay.
Okay, here we go.
we
So here we go to this. Okay. Okay. African Americans and the church. There was first the conditional Anglicization of slaves. Christianity essentially and white control that would continue after the Civil War and into the 20th century. Different dioceses took different approaches. Virginia supplied reading, tried to give slave owners reading materials to help teach their slaves. William Meade republished a series of sermons from Thomas Bacon in colonial Maryland. The Southern Churchmen had a series of stories in it, kind of like Goofus and Gallant in Highlights, if you remember that. They were Sambo and Tony stories. Tony was the good slave and Sambo was the bad slave. And these were to be read to slaves to teach them how to behave appropriately. In Mississippi, there were many more slave chapels or slave churches that were constructed than on the East Coast. And there was much effort in this ministry. One missionary to slaves wanted to work with nearby whites, but was told by Bishop Green that his charge was to serve slaves, and that's what he was to do. There was also clearly less preparation for ministers who were preaching to slaves than those who were preaching to a white congregation. Most sermons delivered to slaves were extemporaneous. They were not from a text like you would have for a white congregation. You even have examples of some bishops in the South trying to silence abolitionist newspapers run by Episcopal clergy in the North. In South Carolina and Mississippi, there's evidence of slaves donating funds to African missions. St. Philip's, I think St. Philip's, established in Richmond by 1859, was an African-American parish, probably planned for earlier in Alexandria by Bishop Johns, but the Civil War caused him to leave Alexandria for the safety of Richmond. There was also the case of Absalom Jones, the first Episcopal priest who was an African American. In the 1780s, he belonged to St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia. And in 1787, Richard Allen, who formed the AME Church, tried to create a separate Black congregation, but the white clergy at St. George's opposed this. Allen and Jones then organized what they called the Free African Society. Now, this was not a church. It included Black Philadelphians of all religions. Richard Allen continued at St. George's while plans for the Free Society were worked out. As the only Black minister in Philadelphia, whites often could not find seats at St. George's when Allen was preaching. In response, the people at St. George's segregated whites and Blacks and left the balcony for Blacks. When Allen and Jones knelt in the white section in protest, a white usher tried to have them picked up and removed. This led to an African-American exodus from St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia. In 1794, Allen started Bethel Church, the mother church for the AME denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Absalom Jones stayed with the Free African Society and encouraged its members to choose a denomination. And he not so subtly encouraged them to choose to become Episcopalians, which became St. Thomas African Episcopal Church. Jones was licensed by William White, Bishop William White of Pennsylvania, as a lay reader. I mean, it said there were what was the word? Essentially, it said there were problems, and what people then said it was because Absalom Jones had not studied Latin or Greek. The parish petitioned the diocesan convention for his ordination as a priest and deacon, and in 1795 he was ordained a deacon, in 1804 priest. What they said is that there were peculiar circumstances at present, either no knowledge of Latin and Greek, or more likely that he was African American. And these peculiar circumstances meant that St. Thomas African Episcopal Church could not send clergy and lay delegates to Pennsylvania's diocesan convention. This was likely intended as temporary, but they did not receive representation in diocesan convention in Pennsylvania until after the Civil War had begun. Okay, we can go back to that slavery handout, Hillary. Okay. There were other African American congregations established in the North. There was St. Philip's in New York City, originally African American Episcopalians from Trinity Wall Street. There was St. James, Baltimore, whose rector came from St. Thomas African Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. And this was a church for both slave and free African Americans, although free blacks ended up opposing having slaves in the congregation. St. Luke's, New Haven was another African American church, a congregation from African Americans at Trinity on the Green in New Haven. St. Matthew's, Detroit, 1851, a parish that was a strong supporter of the abolition movement. Now, the church, as the Civil War came on, well, you've got other instances. Here's some other instances. In Portsmouth, there was a church that had pews painted black where African Americans were supposed to sit if they attended the church, probably sailors in port. I believe your first rector, Adam Empey, was an opponent of slavery, although he apparently owned slaves, and it was possible for someone for a relative to own the slaves. There's work by a good scholar who argues that the slaves did not want to leave because they were treated so well. But when Empey left the presidency at the College of William and Mary, they hired someone who was very, very pro-slavery. And your second rector, George Cummins, was apparently a brilliant preacher. There were people who would only come to church if they knew he was preaching that day. And then they got a little tired of his flamboyance. He later, as part of the protest against the Oxford movement and the high church and ritualism, left the church and founded the Reformed Episcopal Church and was its first bishop. The National Church did not take a real issue on slavery or on the Civil War. They did not take an issue on political matters, in part because some clergy did not even vote because they believed they should stay out of politics. When Governor DeWitt Clinton died in New York, the bishop ordered his clergy not to preach about him in their sermons. Bishop Meade apologized for talking about the Civil War in public after the war had begun. A Richmond newspaper criticized some Episcopal clergy in Richmond for meeting with clergy from other denominations to pray for peace in the United States before the Civil War. So clergy were often very much removed from politics. So the Civil War has begun, and one of the great preachers of the day, Phillips Brooks of Boston, said it was time to stop shilly-shallying, that the church was unsure whether there was a war going on or not, and whether if there was, it would be safe for them to say so. So they don't even want to talk about it. In fact, the Episcopal Church, yes, the Episcopal Church, since that's one of the major churches that had not split North and South over the issue of slavery, is in the early 1860s suggesting that they might be able to act as a mediator between North and South to save the Union. Two of the largest slaveholders in the country were Bishop Polk of Louisiana and Bishop Stephen Elliott of Georgia, huge holdings of slaves. The presiding bishop at the time, Bishop Hopkins of Vermont, offered a biblical defense of slavery. He said that slave owners had a great moral duty to spread the gospel to their slaves, and that slavery was a way of bringing Christianity to blacks, a missionary institution, if you will. This also became a justification for expatriation, like the American Colonization Society, and sending freed slaves to Africa. Many Virginia clergymen supported this. Charles Dana, William Meade was a founding member. Francis Scott Key, not a clergyman, but a Maryland evangelical, was a supporter of the American Colonization Society. So was John Marshall. Religious support for slavery even found some sympathy in the Northern High Church Party, because they're suspicious of moral perfectionism. They're suspicious of these benevolent societies. They're suspicious. I mean, think of the evangelicals. Many of the supporters of abolition in the North were evangelicals. If you could change, if you could be saved in an instant, you could give up slavery in an instant, you could give up drinking in an instant. The high church was suspicious of this moral perfectionism, and this fit in with their idea of grace working slowly over time, rather than the sort of road to Damascus experience. And again, the primitive church had not addressed this issue. So for the high church, this was not a question. The primitive church had not talked about it. Samuel Seabury, son of the bishop, and Bishop John Hopkins of Vermont, supported slavery, and Hopkins even wrote in support of secession for the South. And one of the reasons the church did not split over slavery was the diversity of opinions in the North over slavery. You had people like Samuel Seward, who were Episcopalians, who opposed, and William Stanton or Edwin Stanton, who opposed slavery, and others who supported it, some who taught at General Theological Seminary. When the Confederacy left the Union, well, let me get these statistics first. Of the 112 canonically resident clergy living in Virginia in 1860, there were 112. Of those in the 1860 census that have been found, there were 103, and 84 of them owned slaves. The Confederate Church, or the Confederate States, ended up establishing a new church. In their opinion, Bishop Polk said, we must follow our nationality, that the states have left the Union, so we need to form a new church. Bishop Meade agreed. They had their first general council. They changed the name from convention to council, and some dioceses are changing council back to convention now. They had their first general council in 1862 and emphasized the duty to spread Christianity to slaves, even issuing a pastoral letter and a resolution. That this church desires specially to recognize its obligation to provide for the spiritual wants of that class of our brethren, who in the providence of God have been committed to our sympathy and care by the national institution of slavery. This, to the Confederate Church, was a way of elevating African Americans both morally and religiously. It was using slavery as the evangelistic tool that they believed God had intended it to be. That slaves were not merely property, but a sacred trust from God that must be treated, or who must be treated properly. As for the church, the Episcopal Church in the United States of America, they held their General Convention in 1862 and refused to recognize the schism in the church. They refused to recognize that the churches in the southern diocese had left and called their names during the roll and simply marked them absent. On the other hand, the General Convention of 1862 refused to mention either the Emancipation Proclamation or the victory at Antietam. They had friends on both sides of this issue, and in some states there were very difficult situations, like in Maryland, which was a slave state in the Union. They didn't want to weaken the position of Maryland. They condemned the rebellion of the southern states, but not the reason for it. At General Convention in 1865, the presiding bishop, Bishop Hopkins, invited the bishops from Arkansas and North Carolina to come to convention, and they did. Found they were treated very well. That convention offered no resolution celebrating the Union victory, but rather recognized the end of hostilities and the return of peace. Lay and Atkinson, the Bishop of Arkansas and the Bishop of North Carolina, were very impressed and urged the Southern bishops to return to the Episcopal Church in the United States. The Confederate General Council of 1865 gave those Southern dioceses permission to do so. And in 1866, Virginia did return to the Episcopal Church in the United States, and Virginia was the last Southern diocese to do so. I've got a section down here on the Southern churchmen about the attitudes in some newspapers. The Southern churchmen, the Diocese of Virginia's weekly newspaper, actually the editorial spoke more for the editor than it did for the diocese on some occasions, was more moderate than some papers. For instance, after Preston Brooks caned Charles Sumner in the Senate, and the Richmond Press failed to censor him for doing that, the Southern churchmen criticized the secular press as apologists for evil. On the other hand, they attacked abolitionists as people who denied the divinity of Christ and claimed that Uncle Tom's Cabin was popular among men of the theater, harlots, and blasphemers. So there, that's their stand. In January 1861, as the Lower South is seceding, the Southern churchmen urged Virginia Episcopalians not to support radical secessionists, but then in February they got out of politics, only to say that they would promote only the gospel and would not get into political concerns. As I said, the last Episcopal diocese in the South to return to the Church of the United States was Virginia in 1866, and by then they're trying to deal with other issues in the church. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bond. I want to open it up to questions, if that's all right with you, for a few minutes.
Okay.
In case I missed any from the chat box, or if I have someone who asked, what are tracts?
Oh, a tract is like a pamphlet. And in this case, the tracts were a series of pamphlets written about issues in the English church. The first being national apostasy, about Parliament having too much say in the church. And then there was the infamous Tract 90, which tried to reconcile the Articles of Religion with Roman Catholic theology.
And some people might be familiar with the name of Newman, Cardinal
John Henry Newman.
Mm-hmm.
Later, John Henry Cardinal Newman.
Yes. Kathy Phillips has a question. What was going on in Episcopal colleges, men and women's, in the South during this time?
Well, you had one major one, that was the University of the South, which was begun in the mid-1850s so that Southern men would not have to go north and deal with potential ideas that might harm slavery.
Melinda Davis asks, what on earth does abolitionism have to do with the divinity of Christ?
You would have to ask the editors of the Southern Churchmen.
Probably not very much.
Probably not very much. But this is a period when the middle class rioted against things they didn't like. Abolition, the theater, temperance, and so forth. Yes, there were a number of Episcopal churches that had at least Sunday schools for slave children. And one of the questions we don't know is how many of those slave children in emancipation returned to the Episcopal Church. John Lynch of Natchez, he was educated at Trinity Church here in town in the Sunday school, not at Jefferson Military College where Jefferson Davis would have been educated, but he later, as a justice of the peace, used the Book of Common Prayer when he performed marriages and said that he had returned to the church of his youth. That he had a particular fondness for the Episcopal Church.
Let's see, James Wiggins has a question here.
Jim, no, I mean, some, you're going to have some evangelicals in the North were going to oppose slavery and secession, but you've got enough, and you've got high church people who oppose it, but you've also got those who approve of both secession and slavery. So it doesn't break on church parties that way. That high church is pro-secession, the evangelicals are anti-secession or something like that.
And Elizabeth Harvard asks, I'm curious about the role of the Episcopal Church. Is it intended to be engaged in politics or not? Clearly, there are opinions on both sides, but at large, what does the Episcopal Church recommend?
I'm not sure what the church recommends now, but I know that it was a long time before clergy felt comfortable getting into politics, because it was an expectation, especially among the high church, that they not do so. But you've also got people like Bishop Meade and Bishop Elliott, Bishop Meade especially an evangelical, who did not think he should be involved in politics, that was not an issue for the church.
I would say too, to follow up with Dr. Bond, the Episcopal Church by and large is supportive of clergy speaking out about issues that occur in communities. That's where the word polis comes from, the people, the community, the city, and speaking to them from a place of the gospel. You'll see a variety of movements about a variety of different issues. Where they draw the line is explicit support for one party or another, in particular from the pulpit. But speaking about issues is certainly within the bailiwick of clergy and other church leaders too.
So sympathetic neutrality.
Was St. James's considered high church or evangelical?
That's very hard to say. Adam Empey seems to have been a high church, but George Cummins was clearly a fairly extreme evangelical. I thought at times that Empey and one other priest stayed in Virginia just to irritate Bishop Meade, who was an extreme evangelical. I believe he excommunicated a vestryman at one parish because he let his daughters go to a dance.
And Alice Toussignan says, who's one of the members of our history team, says, to give everyone a glimpse of next Wednesday, Dr. Peterkin preached in support of secessionism. And so that would have been like around 1859, 1860, I think. He was the rector then.
Yes, he was the third rector.
I'm curious if there's a connection at all, if you know if there's a connection between St. James's being founded the same decade as VTS, Virginia Theological Seminary, is founded, and the divisions between the 1830s were really hot between the high church and evangelical parties. So that's part of the reason why VTS was founded then, if I'm not wrong. So did St. James's have anything to do with that, if you know?
I have no idea why St. James was founded when it was. I know Virginia Episcopalians did not want to send seminarians to New York, to General. And I think in the first several dozen years of VTS's existence, it had very few seminarians from North Carolina, because North Carolina was a very high church diocese, and they went to General Theological Seminary in New York.
Interesting. Well, I don't know if it's true or not, but there's legend that part of the reason why St. James's altar, if you all recall back to our sanctuary, it is technically a table because it's perched up on legs. The legend has it it's because one of the bishops would come in and stick his crook, the crook being like his shepherd's staff, and like knock it about to make sure that there were legs and not a proper altar. So I don't know if that's true or not.
Would you say that was a bishop?
Yes.
I can see Bishop Meade doing that. Bishop Meade pretty much ordered one parish not to use Gothic revival architecture because it was too Anglo-Catholic.
I had always assumed the fact that we now have an unattached altar was a product of the renovation after the fire. I assumed we had always had an attached altar. I didn't go to St. James's then, and I assumed we had brought it out after the fire. I never knew that.
Melinda, it was actually, the table was brought out about 35, maybe 40 years ago. It had been attached to the reredos, but it came out during another renovation at some point.
Ah, okay. Thanks, Harry.
Any other questions? I'm afraid I can't see everybody. So like Linda, if you want to ask a question, go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in.
Oh.
Elizabeth Harvard says, this has been excellent. And thank you so much, Dr. Bond. And I echo her thanks and very much appreciate your hour with us. This has been just wonderful. So I don't know if you can see everybody. I'll take us out of, I'll stop spotlighting you. And if you can, if you all desire to applaud, or you can just wave your hands like jazz hands. So thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
I want to go ahead and give folks a heads up that I will be including a link to this recording in our in a follow-up email tomorrow. So be on the lookout for that, and I'll include any other handouts or notes or things, follow-up materials that Dr. Bond or our history group recommends. Next Wednesday, we get to hear from our history team for the first time. They'll be following up on talking more about St. James's and the various things that they dug up in the midst of their researches. So you don't want to miss that. Do come back. And if you are, since you are registered, you do not need to register again. We will send you the Zoom link as in a reminder email. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope to see you next week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Fascinating.